And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I'm your host, Demo, and this is 5 decks that I never lost with. I just thought this would be an interesting video to make. These are decks that I have made in the past. I don't have them anymore, that I played a few games with and never lost a single game. So, a few addendums here before we begin. First things first, I do not have any deck lists, so please don't ask. I know there's going to be people in the comments who are going to ask anyway if I have a deck list for any of these. I do not. These are all decks that I used to have and took apart a long time ago. The other addendum here, this is casual, okay? I know there's going to be someone in the comments section that's going to tell me they got some crazy Najeela or Urza deck that they would have stomped my butt with. I'm sure you would have, but these were casual games that I was playing, and so it was a relatively equal power level, okay? And I ranked these decks in basically what I consider to be the power level for them. So starting out at number 5, Tymna and Bruce. And I had a huge partner phase where I was just trying to match up every single partner. I mean, I must have made at least 40 decks, maybe 50 decks with all different partner combinations. And of course, Tymna was one that I used a lot because she's really powerful. In fact, you could even make the argument that she isn't very casual, and she appears twice on this list, and that is sort of part of the reason why I took a lot of these decks apart. I will get to why I took them apart. I mean, why would I take apart a deck that I'm winning with all the time, right? That doesn't make any sense. How this deck worked basically was pretty simple. It was an attacking theme, obviously, because attacking worked good with Bruce, also worked good with Tymna, and also I'm drawing lots of cards, I'm gaining lots of life, which is a very underrated thing in casual commander game, and then I basically just filled the deck with a lot of creatures that I wanted to be connecting with, that I would get the draw off of my Tymna, and I would get the double strike from Bruce and get double the effect off that creature, and then the rest of the deck was just lots and lots of removal. This was in my phase where I started putting more and more removal in my deck. And of course, Mardu Colors does removal really well. So I just packed this deck full of removal, and just basically anything my opponents did, I just destroyed it. And I would run over my opponents. It was just an aggro deck. You know, it was basically a Mardu aggro deck where I just stopped my opponents from doing whatever they were doing. I drew lots of cards and I gained tons of life. And I played 2 games in a row with this deck when I first put it together, won both games pretty handily, and I was obviously very happy with the deck, so I left it alone, went on to do other things, came back a little while later, played a couple more games with it, and stomped my opponents again. And I really started to feel like the deck was just, first of all, I wasn't sure if it was casual. You know, I mean, it was definitely a very high power level, an 8 for sure. But also, it wasn't a ton of fun. You know, I got to play a deck that's a lot of fun. And, you know, I was playing an aggro theme, which I don't super love. And then other than that, mostly what the deck was just doing was drawing cards and destroying my opponent's stuff. So I didn't find it to be super fun, so I took it apart. And that's the case with most of the decks on this list, is I would find that they just either weren't that fun or they were maybe too powerful for a casual game, and that's why I took them apart. Coming in at number 4 is my Wasatora deck. That's right, I had a Wasatora deck that I never lost a game with. So what was I doing with that deck? Well, that deck came about because I actually wanted to make a Wasatora deck. And I looked at her ability and I thought, okay, well, she deals combat damage to a player. That player sacrifices a creature. If they can't, you create a 3/3 black, red, and green cat dragon creature token with flying. Okay, so I'm creating flying cat tokens. My commander is a flyer, and I sort of just came up with this idea that why don't I just make a deck where all my creatures have flying, and then I can hate on non-flying creatures, right? And red does that really, really well. Red has lots and lots of cards for hating on non-flying creatures. Mudslide is one that I mentioned on my 10 cards video. I had Fault Line in there for sweeping out those non-flying creatures. And then what green does really well is kill flying creatures, of course, but I didn't want the board wipe for flying creatures. I wanted the spot removal, right? So I put lots of stuff in there, spot removal for flying creatures in green. So that way I was dealing with all the creatures. And then on top of that, my commander has that sacrifice ability. But basically I wanted to kill all my opponent's creatures so that when I connected, I would guaranteed get that cat dragon token. And again, just like the last deck, I just put tons of removal in the deck as well. Jun does that also really, really well. So the deck really was a whole ton of board wipes, a lot of removal. My opponents never had a creature on board, and as you can imagine, they didn't have a lot of fun. Like, they just weren't really enjoying it. Both games I played with this deck, I won both of them. And both games I played, I had people just up and quit. So, for me, always it comes back to me having a fun, casual game. That's what Commander is all about. So if my opponents aren't having fun to the point where they just want to up and leave, that doesn't really work either, right? So again, I took that deck apart after only 2 games. But nevertheless, it was undefeated. Coming in at number 3, PAKO and Haldan deck I made. And this deck was really quite simple. When I first saw PAKO and Haldan, I thought it's an interesting one. It's a fun one. And of course, obviously a lot of people agree with me because it is currently the most popular partner combination from C20 with over 1,800 decks. How I built a PAKO and Haldan deck? No creatures. That's it. I put no creatures in the deck because Haldan says you may play non-creature cards from exile with fetch counters on them. So I didn't want to put any creatures in that deck because if I exiled creatures off the top of my own library, then I wouldn't be able to cast them, right? And that it's just gone. I'll never be able to get it back. So I thought if I put nothing but non-creature cards in the deck, then I'm guaranteed to get something off the top of my library. So that way, every time I attack with my PAKO, I'm always going to get at least one thing that I can cast. And so I just bring my PAKO out, I attack, I exile everyone's libraries. I do that for a while and then wait a while. You don't want to cast your Haldan right away because he doesn't do anything until you have a bunch of cards in exile. So I would wait a few turns, attack. And what I didn't expect and what I think a lot of people have realized is your PAKO gets really big really fast and he can close out the game on his own pretty quickly. You really don't need any other creatures in the deck. It sort of is almost a Voltron deck on top of the fact that it's a huge card advantage engine. It's a really great deck and I think I've even seen it in CEDH games because these two are a really powerful combination. I mean, it's probably one of the most popular partner pairings out there. And I played about 4 or maybe 5 games with this deck, never lost a single game, just tons and tons of value, smashing my opponents with my huge PAKO, and the rest of my deck was just a whole lot of control stuff, right? I'm destroying what my opponents are doing, I'm countering what they're doing, and I would just outvalue my opponents with it and took the deck apart. And obviously a lot of people came along after and realized how powerful of a partner pairing this is. And the deck became really, really popular. But yeah, it was basically just a PAKO Haldan deck. And the only thing I was doing that was maybe a little bit different was I just didn't put any creatures in there so that I was guaranteeing myself the value. That's about it. Coming in at number 2 is my Damia Sage of Stone deck. And Damia is one of those ones that, when I first saw it right away, when I started playing Commander, I was like, oh man, that's so cool. I want to play that. It just seems like such a cool commander. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have fewer than 7 cards in hand, draw cards equal the difference. So you can draw up to 7 cards. I just thought that was fantastic. Was really, really popular though. So, and again, obviously I avoid popular commanders. So I just avoided Damia for a long, long time until it started to fall in popularity a little bit. I think of all the decks on this list, this is probably the one I played with the most recently. Damia has fallen off quite a bit. She's under 1,000 decks. She is 11th just among Sultai commanders alone. So once it got to a point where I didn't really see her in commander games anymore, I realized, hey, maybe it's time for me to make a deck. And I thought, well, what am I going to do with it? It's a commander that can just draw you a bunch of cards. And I thought, well, since I have a commander that is refilling my hand all the time, why don't I just make everyone discard? And that became the deck. The deck was basically, I had a whole bunch of effects like Cunning Lethomancer and Mind Slicer that would just make everyone discard. And of course, that's going to hurt my opponents a whole lot, not really going to hurt me at all, because then I'll just slap my Damia down and I get to draw 7 cards. So the whole deck was essentially, again, lots of removal. Of course, you always got to have lots of that to stop whatever your opponents are doing. And again, Sultai Colors does that really, really well. I had counter spells, I had Assassin's Trophies and all that good stuff to stop my opponents from what they were doing, but also I'm making them discard their hands. It's really difficult for people to get their game plan going when they don't have a hand. And of course, I could just slap my Damia down and just refill my hand. So I'm sitting there with 7 cards in hand. None of my opponents had any. So obviously I won a lot of games that way. I think I played 3 games with this deck, won them all. Obviously nobody was having fun, right? Nobody at the table was enjoying themselves because they were just really doing a whole lot of sitting there doing nothing. The game plan was sound. It was really, really sound. It worked exactly as I expected, but it just wasn't fun. It wasn't fun for me to just sit there, be playing Magic, and my opponents just sit there doing nothing. Didn't really like it, so I took the deck apart, even though I didn't lose a game with it. And coming in at number 1 is my Tymna and Tana deck. And this is one of the first partner pairings I ever did. And like I said, I was really on a partner kick for a long time. And also this was the phase of my commander building where I wanted to play more colors. I was actually trying to get more colors in my decks so that I could play more cards, like a lot of people do. And my decks were getting more and more expensive, as decks with more colors tend to do. I was putting more expensive cards in there, dual lands and such. This is actually the deck I was playing when I tell the story in my Is It Casual or Not video about playing the dual lands, and one of my opponents destroyed all the lands, and then when I said something about that not being very casual, he said, oh yeah, well you're playing dual lands, that's not very casual. That's the deck I was playing when that happened. So that, to me, this deck was incredibly powerful. I mean, it does basically what these two commanders are doing. I'm attacking, drawing tons of cards, I make Saproling tokens. Those Saproling tokens I can throw at opponents. If they die, I don't care. I'm just trying to get card draw off of them. Tons and tons of card draw. It's a very aggro deck. It was very similar to, say, an Edgar Markov deck, except with the added bonus of I get to draw lots of cards. Again, tons of removal. This was the first time I had used Fervent Charge in a deck, and I thought fit perfectly in this theme. Just super fast, super aggro, lots of removal, lots of card draw. I was running over my opponents. I think I had played 5 games with this deck, won all of them. And, you know, I'm a pretty self-aware person. So I notice things like this. I notice like, hey, I'm running over people in these games. A lot of these games were even 3v1. I would just kill every single opponent by myself without anyone else really doing anything at all. And that combined with the comment that one person had made about the dual lands, and I was thinking, man, is this deck even casual? And that was the first time that I really started to become self-aware about whether or not my decks were too powerful to be played in a casual game. You know, so really there's a lesson to be learned here, right? If we bring this all in for the lesson of the day, basically all of these decks, the commonality is, and why I took them apart is, yeah, they were good and I won a lot of games, but for me, is it actually a casual deck is the question I'm always asking myself, and I'm asking other people to ask themselves. And also, are we having fun? You know, if we're not having fun, then why am I playing this deck? If I'm running all over my opponents and they can't do anything, then why am I even playing it? If I am destroying everything my opponents have and they can't keep a creature in play, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. If I'm making my opponents discard their whole hands and they're just sitting there doing nothing while I'm playing Magic, that's not really fun. So all of these decks I took apart because yes, they were fantastic and I never lost a game with them, but they weren't fun. And maybe they weren't even casual. And that's really, at the end of the day, what it's all about for me, is having a fun, casual game with everyone at the table. So what do you think? You have any decks that you played that you realized, hey, maybe these decks aren't casual and I maybe shouldn't be playing them in a casual game anymore? Made any decks that you are undefeated with? Let me know in the comments below. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.